First video of 2024. Hello everyone, welcome back. We are going to be following up on Joe's Threadripper build. This is about a $10,000 total system that we assembled back in December, due largely in part to the fact that it has a 32 terabyte SSD configuration with 8 4 terabyte M.2 NVMe SSDs provided by Lexar. So let's get the initial report filed right away. Does it work? Yes. Totally works. I have updated the BIOS. All of the M.2 NVMe SSDs are recognized. However, there were a few new bits of information that have come to light that we should address. Excellent! Today's video is brought to you by the Paul's Hardware store on paulshardware.net, the only official source for Paul's Hardware merchandise, tantalizing t-shirts, brilliant beer sets, high-quality hoodies, and more, all featuring the classic thumbscrew for tasteful and refined viewers, or the 8-bit thumbscrew for tasteful and refined viewers who hate curves. New designs are added sporadically and at random, so head over to paulshardware.net and get some of that sweet, sweet merch right now. Or not right now, after you watch the video. Either way. Definitely check out the two-part build video if you haven't already. The assembly of this system was actually a lot of fun. We did have to deal with some quirks and eccentricities because it's a high-end desktop PC with a lot more hardware in it than we typically do with a gaming PC. We decided to use this case pretty early on because it's a new case from Lian Li, the 011 Vision PC Master Race Edition, and that presented some airflow challenges. We wanted to use an air cooler for the CPU because this is a production machine and we don't want to have to deal with any downtime in case a pump failure happens or something like that. But we also wanted the system to be very visually appealing as well as very powerful, which is why we have added extra RGB stuff, which isn't really necessary from a functional standpoint, but it does look quite pretty. And that's where one of the first controversial decisions came into play. We have intake at the bottom, we also have an exhaust at the back, and we went with 2 intakes for the GPU cooler and an exhaust at the top, and we're going to need to provide a little bit of separation behind the motherboard tray for that, which we will be doing today. And who knows, maybe that was a horrible idea, but we'll find out with some testing. Also, because the motherboard we chose has sort of a unique slot layout for the PCI Express expansion slots, and also because I was told by Gigabyte that only the top slot would work with PCI Express bifurcation, which is needed in order to address all 4 of the M.2 NVMe SSDs in this add-in card with full bandwidth. We thought we needed to install it in the top slot. But if you guys watch Wendell over on Level 1 Techs, he did a review of this motherboard where he showed pretty clearly that PCI Express bifurcation actually is enabled with all 3 slots. You just need the updated BIOS. But it was specifically the slot layout and the fact that we thought we couldn't install the GPU to the top slot, which is why we went with this graphics card, which does include an all-in-one liquid cooler, which yes, somewhat defeats my purpose of going with the not all-in-one liquid cooler for the CPU, but we didn't have much choice because we needed an RTX 4090 that was 3 slots or slimmer, and this is the only one I have that fits the bill other than my Founders Edition, and I'm sorry Joe, you can't have my Founders Edition 4090. So lastly, because my recap is getting a bit long-winded, we have a 4K capture card that we wanted to install in the lowest slot. That was actually still conflicting with this graphics card, even though it is just slightly wider than 2 slots. So we used some risers to drop it down a little bit lower, which means it's now partially blocking one of the fans. But don't worry, for any of you guys who really didn't like that we went with that route, and thank you to all of you guys who were like, that's awesome, just make it janky, whatever works. But the first thing we're gonna do today, now that I know that the system works, is we're just gonna shuffle some stuff around here to give you guys what is probably a much more sensible layout. We can move the GPU up to the top slot, move the add-in card with the M.2s to the second slot, and that should give us plenty of access to put the 4K capture card in the lowest slot. So pretty straightforward here. We're gonna swap-seize the graphics card and the add-in card, and then we will be able to remove the risers from the 4K capture card, bring that up and install it directly into the 3rd slot. The real trick is can I move this card without unplugging anything? I think I can. We can now get a proper look at our PCI Express extension for this 4K capture card. For the record, this totally was functional. It totally worked. It's just obviously not the ideal solution, so we are going to bypass it. And all this was 2 90-degree adapters that allowed us to install our 4K capture card down there. So we're going to reinstall it there, but let's do the add-in card first. That seems a better hierarchy to me. And lastly, the 4K 60 Pro right down here. as God intended. It also means that this bracket at the bottom, we will no longer need to pass through like HDMI cables, so we can reinstall this. There, now it goes big, medium, small. And for anyone who was looking at, again, the part 1, part 2 videos, thinking, Paul, what are you thinking? What were you planning? What did you have in mind? This is what I had in mind. So I'm glad PCIe bifurcation works on more than just the top slot so that we could reconfigure these cards. One other item to address before we run a few tests, and that is this area right here. We have this fan, which is acting as an exhaust, pushing air out, and the lower 2 fans are pulling air in. Obviously, we don't want a conflict in here, air mixing between, just be a bunch of like weird thermal issues going with the air mixing that way. So we're gonna do very temporarily, and we might be replacing this ideally in the future. Our friend Brian BPS Customs offered to use his 3D printing skills to make a bracket or something a little bit more permanent, but just for the sake of testing and to determine if this is even a good idea or if we should switch some things around. And definitely there's a very good case to be made for these 2 fans on the GPU radiator to be exhausts so that the heat from the graphics card is being immediately pushed out of the case instead of bringing more warm air into the case. But at least to test this initial configuration, I'm going to be using this high-grade piece of foam, and I'm going to cut a little piece out of it here, and I'm going to tape it in with some gaff tape, and it's going to be functional enough to direct that airflow so that we don't get cross-contamination between these 2 sets of fans. I guess this is another moment of truth since we've reconfigured things a little bit, but hopefully everything continues to work. Fingers crossed.
Day 2.
The system is reconfigured. It looks much better this way, and while some of us did appreciate the janky way that we had initially set it up, I think this is going to be better. We're going to get into some benchmark testing next, but before I do that, let's talk about the bad stuff. Let's talk about things that haven't gone according to plan, other than the fact that we had to do all that messing around with the PCI Express bifurcation thing. Initial setup of the system actually went pretty smoothly, and all 8 of those M.2 NVMe drives that we installed were recognized, even the ones with the add-in card adapter. PCI Express bifurcation does function on this motherboard, and it functioned with the top slot initially, and now that we have updated the BIOS to version F2, which is the most current one that's available, it still works, and the bifurcation is set to automatic by default, with which our configuration was able to immediately recognize all of the SSDs and assign them their proper lane configuration for PCI Express Gen 4 lanes per SSD. However, after I chose one of those SSDs to install Windows 2 and then did a BIOS update, the system was hanging upon boot, and fortunately, thanks to the LED readout code on the motherboard, I was able to determine that it was during the memory stage of post that it was hanging. Ryzen 7000 series CPUs do have a bit of a notorious reputation for taking a long time to go through memory training. That's supposed to be improved or fixed, or at least slightly better, with the Threadripper 7000 series CPUs, and I did attempt to wait, I think as much as 20 or 30 minutes for it to get past that process. It's possible that by waiting even longer, it would have gotten through that process and posted normally after that, but I bypassed it by removing all of the memory sticks except one in the A1 slot. That allowed the system to post again, get into Windows, refresh Windows updates. Then I replaced the 3 memory sticks, and thankfully it booted just fine after that. And now boot up times are actually quite snappy with this system. The second issue is one that's not necessarily immediately correctable, and you can let us know in the comment section if this would be a huge issue for you or not. I noticed during setup that when I was going here to the power button, we don't have a sleep option. We have restart and we have shut down. Often when you're doing initial setup and installing drivers, you need to have the motherboard chipset driver as well as a graphics card driver installed before the sleep option becomes available. But the system is now fully set up with all the hardware recognized and drivers installed, and we still don't have that option. I haven't had a chance to follow up directly with Gigabyte about this, but I was able to dig into some recent posts about this issue with people who have this specific setup, and also check the Gigabyte website for this motherboard, the TRX50 Aero D. This motherboard already has not one new revision, but 2. We have version 1.0, there is a version 1.1, and a version 1.2 now. And with version 1.2, there's actually some hardware changes on the motherboard, at least with the lowest PCI Express slot. They've updated that to be the ultra durable style slot. Now, practically speaking, if the system is otherwise fully functional, it's not really that big of a deal to get a slightly newer revision of the motherboard. However, according to the responses on the posts I was referencing, Gigabyte has told the customers who have reached out to them that if they have a version 1.0 motherboard, they're actually going to need to RMA it and get a version 1.1 or 1.2 if they want sleep to work. Now, that's a little odd to me. That's a little baffling. It's also a little weird to me that although this platform has only been out for about 2 or 3 months, Gigabyte already has not 1 but 2 revisions of this motherboard that they have launched. I could also complain about the fact that the chipset version that Gigabyte has on the downloads support page for this motherboard is still a version from March 2023 that didn't install correctly. I actually used the ASUS website to get the most recent version of the chipset driver for this system. But all that being said, we're paying a little bit of an early adopter tax by going with the original version of this motherboard. And again, sleep. Do you need to be able to sleep? Does the computer need to be able to sleep? Joe's sort of on the fence about this. Again, let us know in the comments section whether or not we need to fix that, because apparently fixing that would require swapping out the motherboard, which is basically rebuilding the system. All right, enough about that. Let's talk about benchmarks, because we do have a quick set of comparative benchmarks to test this system versus not only the 7970X benchmarks that I ran when the platform initially launched, but also to test this upgrade versus Joe's current system, which is a Threadripper 2920X, which is a 12-core 2nd-gen Threadripper, just to see how much faster it is. How much benefit is Joe going to get by using this system versus his old one? So let's start off with Cinebench R23 running the multi-threaded test. And here, Joe's 7970X in this system got 64,348 points on average across 3 tests. And that actually falls right in line with my testing of the 7970X, which was launch testing. So Joe has a benefit of a slightly newer AGESA code and also slightly lower ambient temperatures here in the garage because we're testing now and it's a little bit cooler in the midst of winter. So yes, we can see that the 64-core 7980X, which scored 95,000 in this test, would be a bit faster, but look at that jump from the 2920X, which scored 12,838 up to 64,348. Not a bad improvement. Let's switch over to the single thread results. Here, the 7970X scored 1,919, ever so slightly lower than my numbers. You'll find that my numbers were pretty much comparable to Joe's across the board here. The 7970X with its slightly higher peak clock speed should provide slightly better single thread performance than the 7980X. And then again, a huge jump over the 2920X, almost doubling the single thread score up from 1,049. Of course, the mainstream CPUs here, the 7950X 3D and 14900K, are going to outpace these CPUs in terms of single thread performance. And yes, they are slightly better in terms of pure gaming performance as well. But this system is built for other things besides just gaming. Next, let's look at CPUMark 11, just another all-around CPU performance test. The 2920X managed 25,752 and pretty much times that by 4 to get the current score for the 7970X, which almost hits 100,000. Likewise, with CPUMark, we have a single thread benchmark 2. The 2920X was at 2481. And again, we have a massive step up with the new 7970X going all the way up to 4,135. Next, we have Blender 3.6.0. We're using the Blender Open Data Test, which runs 3 tests: Monster, Junk Shop, and Classroom. And here, Joe's old system, the 2920X, struggled heavily, getting samples per minute scores between 48 and 97 in the test for a total of 207. I have a feeling that the 2920X could probably perform better than that, but you have to also bear in mind that Joe is testing his existing system that has been in use for a while, so it's a bit more cluttered up than a system that has a fresh install designs just for benchmarking. And that's why there's such a score disparity here, with the new 7970X hitting 1,055, again only surpassed by the 64-core version, the 7980X, which had a really impressive 1,671.2 samples per minute. Next is HandBrake. We're just testing video transcoding, going from 4K to a 1080 fast encode. And here we have a frame rate, that's how many frames per second the CPU can encode, as well as a overall time that the test took to complete. Joe's old system took about 4 minutes to complete this test, 233.6 seconds, 35.8 frames per second. And again, we have a huge leap with the new CPU, about tripling the performance to 113.9 frames per second, completing the test in just over a minute, 73.5 seconds. So since we're purely testing transcoding here, this will apply not just to stuff like HandBrake, but also to other tasks like taking raw video that we're going to be editing with and transcoding proxies. But to round out these tests, we also ran 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme just to show a brief sampling of gaming performance. I did not run this test in my initial Threadripper testing, so we're just looking at Joe's old computer versus his new computer here. And also bear in mind that Joe's old computer is running an RTX 3080 currently, which is not going to have as much performance as the RTX 4090 that's installed here. Still, Joe's old overall score was 7,771. New one is 12,864. Graphics scores jumping by about 4,000. 12,080 was the result for the new system. I will point out that the RTX 4090, when paired with a gaming-specific CPU like the 79X3D, can actually go quite a bit higher than that in this test. It can get up to around 19,000 points. More realistically though, when Joe's going to be gaming like at 4K, you're not going to see a whole lot of difference between the mainstream gaming-focused CPUs and a monster CPU like the 32-core 7970X, because it's the CPU score that really matters here, and the CPU score was 20,363. Again, more than quadruple Joe's 2920X's score of 4,971. Let's round things out with one more chart to show you guys temperatures. We had lots of people who were a little bit skeptical of our choice to go with an air cooler for this system. Now, don't get me wrong, you guys, water cooling is good. Water cooling can often be awesome. And yes, water cooling is typically more efficient at taking the heat generated by a CPU or a graphics card and shuttling it off to be distributed throughout your home via fans and radiators. But that does not mean that air coolers universally suck. And that does not mean that an air cooler like a tower cooler like this one, designed by Noctua, which has a pretty good reputation for designing air coolers, suddenly cannot keep up simply because of the existence of water coolers. Case in point, look at this chart right here. These are the peak temperatures that I saw with my Threadripper tests, which use a 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler, just about one of the best ones that you can get right now, versus what we got with the Noctua NH-U14S TR5 SP6. Are you noticing anything about these numbers? Are you noticing that the air cooler actually gave us slightly better temperatures than the liquid cooler? Is your mind blown? Again, I need to point out that the ambient temperature in the garage is a few degrees cooler than it was a few months ago when I originally tested Threadripper. So looking at these values here, you could probably call it a wash between the two. We are getting equivalent performance to what we saw with a 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler with this cooler from Noctua. And we just went over all the benchmark results too. We're getting pretty much equivalent performance with an air cooler. So all the air cooler haters, suck it, or blow it, or put it in a push-pull configuration. That's what we're running here. So if it wasn't obvious, we've been working with a little bit of a deadline this week in testing this system because we are about to head to CES. So I wanted to say thank you guys for watching this first video of 2024, and to remind you that next week will be packed with content coming to you from Las Vegas, Nevada. We'll be covering CES, visiting a lot of vendors that we work with there, and we're going to be bringing this system along to help render out the videos, which will be very nice. Part of the reason we needed to get it set up, but also part of the reason why we haven't gone into a little bit further testing in this video. But we're very interested in your feedback. If you guys would like to see more on this system, it's kind of a toss-up. We're not really sure at this point. It could be just fine as is, or maybe we want to swap out to the newer revision of the motherboard. Maybe we want to do the additional testing that I wanted to do, which was swapping the directionality of some of those fans and doing some CPU and GPU stress tests to see which would be ideal there. We of course have no limit to the number of RGB configurations that we could set up. And then of course with all those 4TB NVMe SSDs, we've just sort of done a basic setup with those. We could test like setting up RAID configurations and maximum throughput and all sorts of things. So if you guys have any feedback for us on whether or not you would like to see a follow-up on this, it probably wouldn't be till later in January or February, but leave those comments in the comment section below. Also, if you want to check out the parts that are installed in this system, those are listed down below, and you can also check out the build video if you want to see the assembly of this beast. But thank you so much for watching this video. On behalf of myself and Joe, we have lots of exciting stuff coming in 2024, so stick around, subscribe if you're not already, and check out my store at paulshardware.net, where you can buy high quality merchandise as being demonstrated here, the stuff that we're wearing. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
You don't have to say thank you. It's all for you, Joe.
Yeah, so thank you.